So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever it is for you. My name is Christopher Brown, and without further ado, let's get into my ethical leader presentation. First things first, let's get into my ideal career. So, for my career, I selected strength and conditioning coaching. It's always been something that's near and dear to my heart. It's second to none, but we'll get into that later. So, first things first, a brief description. So, strength and conditioning coaches, as defined by Shoal Hoffman in a 2011 text. It's titled Careers in Strength and Conditioning or Careers in Sport, something like that, right? So she gets into and defines what a strength and conditioning coach does. And first and foremost, their job is to develop athletes for all sports. So you could be assigned to soccer, football, baseball, track and field at any level, right? And their job is to develop those athletes to their best. So in another study, by Comfort et al. In 2018, they addressed not only that do strength and conditioning coaches need to meet the physical needs of athletes, but rather they need to meet their psychological needs as well. For the study, they took just about, they took just about 20 strength and conditioning coaches from all over the world, some from the United States, some from Australia, some were from parts of Europe. And they asked them like, hey, what are your duties? What do you do? And these strength and conditioning coaches that are working with nationally trained athletes claim that not only do they work with them like, hey, we got to get faster, we got to get stronger, they also train them to have a sense of mental fortitude. They can't give up on themselves because they failed one competition, they failed one max lift. That can't be the end of them, right? So in their day-to-day career, they utilize plyometric weights, resistance bands, pretty much any kind of resistance training that's going to help to stimulate type 2 muscle fibers and make them faster, stronger. I mean, if they're an endurance athlete, then it's mostly type 1, but it really just depends on what you're doing, right? There are different kind of machines. So I put et cetera. There's like jump machines. I don't know if you've ever seen them inside your gym, but basketball players use them. They're like a band strapped to their waist and it pulls them back down to the ground. So, there's a million different exercises and machines that these people are using. So their positions can be anywhere. They can be high school strength and conditioning coaches, which actually I just learned was a career. Be a high school strength and conditioning coach. You could work at a college or university or professionally. Generally, at the higher level, you're going to have either more strength and conditioning coaches per sport. It's like in the NFL, you might have 2 or 3 strength and conditioning coaches, one head and a couple of assistants. Or at a small college or a small high school, you might have one that oversees every sports team. It just depends, right? Depending on what level you work at, how committed you are to it will vary, right? So, and lastly, for describing a strength and conditioning coach, their style is inherently tied to servant leadership. So getting into that, so Greener et al. In 2013, they published a paper stating that strength and conditioning coaches had to always be learning. This was, again, done based on interview basis. They always had to be learning, they always had to be evolving, and they always had to go above and beyond and meet the needs of their athletes, whether they were physical or psychological, right? So now we're going to get into how this ties into servant leadership. Cool. So now the idea of servant leadership. So servant leadership as a style defined by Burton et al. In our textbook in one of our textbooks, Sport Leadership in the 21st Century, denotes that servant leadership focus on meeting the follower's needs first, long before you try to meet organizational needs. What this comes down to is you're doing what's best for individual athletes rather than trying to push them to fill this mold created by your organization, right? Just a brief example of this is, let's say you have a quarterback that just took a big hit. He's limping, he might have a concussion, whatever you think might possibly be wrong with him. If you push him to go back out on the field, like you got to be tough, you got to keep going, ultimately, that's your drive to win at any means, at any cost, no matter what. I have to get this victory, even if it costs me this quarterback's health, right? And that's absolutely the opposite of the idea of servant leadership. Cool. So one of the primary examples of servant leadership that we have as Christians is Jesus Christ. So in John 13, the story goes that Jesus' disciples that were following him at the time rented a room in a hotel, I believe, or a room in some kind of motel, some area to stay. And ultimately, there was supposed to be somebody there to wash their feet, but the servant, for whatever reason, was a no-show. And Jesus took it upon himself to lower down to level servant, even though he's the son of the Almighty God. He lowered himself down to a position to wash the feet of his fellow disciples, ultimately his followers, right? So he went out of his way to meet a need that he saw, rather than, I mean, he could have commanded angels to come down and wash their feet, right? There's a million things that could have happened. Cool. So that just after a brief description, I'll go into some of the pros and cons of this style of leadership. So some of the pros cited by Sullivan et al. In his textbook, which is titled Servant Leadership in Sports Theory and Practice, so pretty much applies to me completely, is that the idea is servant leadership is associated with morally just and ethically right practices, right? What he gets into in the first couple of chapters of the text is that in order to implement servant leadership correctly, you can't go into it with this constantly seen idea of win at all costs, right? What I just kind of described. You have to be willing to meet the needs of your players as a coach, as your players, or of your followers first, long before you go into directly trying to win games, right? Your priority is not victory. Your priority is taking care of your athletes, of course, right? So also another pro is that Burton and Peachy go into this. So Burton, this is the same Burton that wrote our textbook, but a couple of years prior to that, Burton and Peachy established this article that was titled "The Call for Servant Leadership in Intercollegiate Athletics," and they go into some of the same ideas, but rather than just the requirements to become a servant leader, some of the benefits of it. So servant leadership can inspire awareness on both ends of the spectrum, right? The coach has to be willing to pay more attention to his athletes, to point out their individual needs, to be able to acknowledge their individual needs. And of course, athletes have to be more aware. As the coach starts to rub off on them, they become more aware of their fellow players' needs. It inspires stewardship, which is the idea of doing the right thing, and commitment to growth, right? So if a coach is out here meeting his players' needs first, there's no way that, like, there can only be one priority is what I'm getting at, right? You have to be willing to push your players for the sake of themselves first, right? For their own health, for their own well-being, rather than pushing your players just for victory. So that's what it's getting at by commitment to growth. Rather than investing in victory for the program, you're investing in the athletes over a long term, right? And coming with that investment are some of the cons, right? So that gets more into the second one. So the first one is that oftentimes servant leaders who are lowering themselves down to meet the needs of their followers are seen as pushovers and spineless. But the Bible tells us that being meek and acting as a servant does not by any means make you weak. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 and 29 of the New International Version says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find the rest of your soul." And you will find rest for your souls. Sorry. So to me, what this is getting at is that Jesus calls us to be like him, right? So those like WWJD bracelets everyone used to wear 10 years ago. The whole idea is that we as Christians, no matter what your standing is, you have to be willing to go out of the way to meet needs that you see others have. Just as Jesus did in this example from the book of John. And that's what he calls us to do. Honestly, at the core of being a Christian, that's what we do, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, all that good stuff. So honestly, if Jesus Christ, literally an omnipotent being, can lower himself to wash his disciples' feet, how could we call someone who's serving others first weak just because they're willing to go out of their way to serve others first? That doesn't make sense to me. So another thing that could possibly be wrong with this is that I think it's Dimotakis et al. In 2020, they did a study on businesses. They took more than 100 bank branches, which had more than 500 employees total, and they compared monetary gains over time. Over the span of 1 year, they compared how much money was made by branches that implemented servant leadership versus branches that implemented other styles of leadership, like anything else. But the problem with comparing directly fiscal results, they didn't take a direct look at possible long-term benefits. So in my opinion, you don't implement servant leadership just so you can win the most games, right? If you wanted to win the most games, you would go something a lot more authoritarian. If you were implementing servant leadership, you're doing it for the long term because you want your athletes to have an overall good experience, athletes or followers, whichever they are. So you want them to do their absolute best over the long term. You want them to want to come back as opposed to just performing for you today and then quitting tomorrow because you pushed them too hard. Cool. So I have one more reference. It's more personal to me. I grew up listening to a lot of Christian rap when I was a kid. So back in 2003, Cross Movement put out a song that was titled Cry No More. And one of the reference from the songs goes like, this is what many of you have in beef with. God's rotisserie style and make a brother's teeth grit because he's quick, but not according to our concept of speed. Looking at man, he thought about the depths of our needs. Right. So it's kind of different, but directly comparing that to the study, the whole idea is that while we look at short-term results, even though the study was over the course of a year, 1 year is nothing compared to the entirety that an employee might be involved or employed at a company for the entirety of the career, right? So if you're employed at this bank for 40 years, this 1 year where you implemented servant leadership might produce lower fiscal results, of course, but 2, 3, 4 years down the road, that might be your best possible option, right? So God style, obviously, Jesus Christ came down to earth and implemented servant leadership. And that whole idea, right, as the last line says, he thought about the depths of our needs, right? He saw that his disciples needed their feet washed. He didn't go out and try and find somebody. He didn't say, hey, other disciple, you do it. You're lower than me. He said, you know what? I'm going to do this because I love you guys and I'm going to wash your feet. Just another reference. So now my ties to strength conditioning, coaching, and servant leadership. So ultimately, it comes down to my own experiences, right? I grew up, my father was working on becoming a pastor and now currently has his pastor's license. And my mother was working on becoming a teacher and now she currently is an English teacher. He has been for the past 7 years, something like that. So servant leadership was implemented both in my mom's classroom, because I observed her as I grew older. Like I work as a substitute teacher now. So sometimes I see her on campus and whenever I'm watching her classes, I can see her meet the individual needs of her students. Obviously, you have to be able to tell a need from a desire, especially when you're dealing with kids that want more time to write their papers. But my mother got really good at that, and I see it. I see it every day that I see her on campus. Also, my father, as a pastor, like I saw him a million times sit down and write a sermon, and I would read over it because I was looking over his shoulder and I was reading it, and he would go in constantly whenever he was giving examples of what we should try to be, what we should ultimately try to live up to, was the example that Jesus put forth for us, which I identified as servant leadership. Also, besides my parents, sports taught me the value of servant leadership and physical strength. So I had a pretty good aptitude for strength when I was younger. So going into my teenage years and as a young adult, I lifted weights, I got stronger, and I could throw further. And my teammates in high school at the time, a lot of them didn't value strength the same way. In their free time, they wouldn't lift weights, they would do other things. So when we get out on the field and we're trying to throw for distance, I'm throwing significantly further than them because I'm putting in that extra time and I'm getting stronger because we didn't spend enough time lifting weights in high school. Also, servant leadership was idealized to me by my first actual collegiate coach, which was at RCC. His name is Nick Robinson. He's an amazing guy. And every time one of us individually needed something, he would go out of his way to help us, whether that cost him extra time after practice, early morning practice before class, whatever he had to do to help meet our needs. If we presented it to them, obviously we have to show him we have a need. He would change his schedule for us. Or if we had a problem in the weight room, my knee was hurt, this or that, he wouldn't force us to squat loading 400, 500 pounds on that blown up knee. There was no point. We weren't going to gain anything from it. And he knew that, right? So he was a great example of servant leadership in my real world experience. In my undergrad, I majored in kinesiology with an emphasis in physical education when I graduated from CSUN, as you can see in the photo below. I learned to appreciate meeting the follower's needs through teaching and coaching. So ultimately, we did a lot of pre-student teaching. We worked a lot with elementary school kids, preschool kids, middle school kids, high school kids, and to see what it meant to them for us to go out of our way to work with them individually to reach this level of skill before we moved on, rather than look at each kid and be like, hey, as long as the majority got it, we can just move on. You could see these kids kind of stay enthralled with the activity. They wanted to keep going because they saw that we were putting in effort to help them reach this desired level. And as a professional, so the past year or so, I have worked slightly in coaching. I'm a substitute teacher, but I coach in my free time. And I worked with, my mom was also the head cheer coach. I worked with them and I helped them just kind of develop the idea of strength and conditioning in their heads. Like we worked a lot of core stuff, but also we spent a few weeks in the weight room. And in the weight room with these athletes, obviously, whenever you're dealing with young kids, a lot of them have no idea what they're doing. So rather than just be like, hey, just go squat as heavy as you can, I spent my time, showed them how to do the exercise, coached them individually as they did the exercise. And if they couldn't do it for whatever reason, they had some kind of, one side was stronger than the other and they couldn't squat right, or they're bench pressing, one side's going up, the other's not. I worked with them, whether that was switching to lunges instead of squats because you can load each side, or for bench press, it might be switching from a barbell to a dumbbell because you have equal weight in each hands. And if you need to go lighter, you need to go lighter, whatever it is, right? So I tried to accommodate for them just in the brief time I worked with them. I worked with them for about a month and a half, 2 months. All right, so very quickly, I'm going to try and get through these. So this presentation doesn't take too much time, but let's get into some effective leadership strategies. So one of them that I selected was athlete coach goal setting. This was something that was first introduced to me in my first year at Cal State Northridge. My coach sat us down right close to before the beginning of season, so right about January-ish, and he only took about 5-10 minutes, and we sat down. We gave him what we thought we were capable of doing this season. He gave us what he thought we were capable of doing this season, and we kind of tried to meet in the middle, right? So for instance, if my personal record in the hammer is 50 meters, and I say, hey, I think I can throw 53 meters this year, he could be like, hey, I think you can throw 55 meters. And then he'll give his rationale why, and you'll give your rationale why, and then you'll see how close you can get in the middle. Okay, so ultimately, I think you can throw 54 and a half. Or maybe he completely convinces you that you can throw further than 53. And honestly, goal setting is one of the biggest things in athletics because if you don't know what you're aiming for, you're not going to know when you get there. You're not going to know how hard to push yourself. You're not going to have any idea of what you think you're capable of, if that makes sense. Secondly, we have performance reviews. So performance reviews are just kind of like the second half of this goal setting, but it's equally as important. So at the end of the season, we had the same kind of 10-minute meeting, and the coach would give us his idea of how he thought we performed this year. You as an athlete would give your idea of how you thought you performed this year. And then we would just kind of try to pick each other's brains about what we could do better for the upcoming year. So an athlete might be like, hey, I thought I worked really well. I threw what our goal was, and I fought through. I had a slight injury about midway through the season, but we healed from it, and then I fought through it to compete, and I scored points at conference, and I helped us win, blah, blah, blah. And that'd be awesome. The coach will give his opinion of it, and then ultimately he'll give you some kind of training plan for over the summer when he doesn't see you, and you guys will look forward to next year. Both of these things are kind of two halves of the same whole, but both equally important, so I had to list both of them. Next, we have some potential ethical issues. So differences. So one issue might be differences between individual needs and organizational goals. So of course, this is going to show up in servant leadership, where, as using the same example as earlier, if I see my quarterback is injured out on the field, but I know this is our starting quarterback, I know he's capable of throwing this pass and winning us the game, I have to make the choice, not as a strength and conditioning coach, but just as a coach overall, I have to make the choice to pull him out of the game and not just try and win at the expense of his health. Because if he goes out there, he gets blitzed by this 250-pound middle linebacker and his knee's blown out, and now he has to get surgery because his ACL is torn, then not only is it on me as a coach because I put him back out there, now this kid isn't going to want to come back, right? He knew that I knew he was hurt, and I still put him in the line of fire. That's terrible of me. So then illegal activity. So I think there's 3 ways that you can see or be known illegal activity. So first way, an athlete can introduce to you that either they're taking something or their friend is on something, whether it's they're drinking alcohol and they're underage, or they're taking steroids, or whatever it is. Secondly, you can overhear it or oversee it. Oversee would be like on social media, you see a picture or a post. Overhear it, they could be in the corner of the weight room snickering, haha, yeah, man, we got hammered at that party last night, or whatever it is. And then, so they can present it to you. You can overhear somebody say it, or you could suspect them of it. So ultimately, that's kind of like you have to have a trained eye, and you can't just very bluntly approach somebody like, hey, you did this. I can tell you did it. You're getting too strong too fast, or you smell like alcohol, you smell like weed, whatever it is. You can't make those assumptions. But as an overseeing adult, you have to be able to pick up on cues, right? So this kid, he's showing side effects of steroids. He put 40 pounds on his bench press in 2 months, which is unheard of unless you're brand new to lifting weights. So I'm putting these warning signs together, and then I would approach it. For all three of these things, I'm going with the direct approach, but this is just a personal stance. I'm not going to let it slide if an athlete is conducting something illegal in my vicinity, right? I have to uphold organizational rules as well as the dignity of this team, right? I'm not going to put myself in a position where I could be found out later because I was trying to be the cool coach and be like, oh, you know what? If you're going to drink, that's okay. I know you're 19, but just do it at your house. Make sure you're not out in public. No, I would absolutely take the direct approach and solve the problem right then and there, hit the nail on the head and be like, hey, dude, like, that's not cool. Like, we're not dealing with that. I'm going to have to let your coach know and proceed with whatever illegal activity it is. I have to make that be known to everybody, and I have to make sure everyone knows that that is not okay. So finally, in conclusion, I don't believe that anyone's style of leadership is perfect. I tried to address some of the major cons of servant leadership that other people have seen, but ultimately, those solutions might not work, right? You may have to make adjustments to your leadership style and start to implement other leadership styles to effectively lead your group. It's the truth, right? Secondly, expectations must be set and maintained. Going in on day one, you have to let your students know, your followers know, that they have to be held accountable, that nothing that they're going to do is just going to be okay, even though you're going out of your way and you're breaking your back to help them out. They can't get away with everything, right? So for example, if one of my athletes wants to fake an injury to get out of squatting, oh, I hurt myself today, I hurt myself today, but he wasn't even at practice and I can tell that he's lying to me, then he needs to know that that's not okay, right? From day one, I have to make sure that everyone knows that lying is not going to be tolerated. And that has to be something that either I punish or make sure that there's like some kind of consequence that people have to face for presenting that to me. And lastly, communication is key. Open lines of communication between followers and leaders has been shown time and time again to promote healthy relationships as well as long-lasting relationships, right? If a follower doesn't feel like he can communicate a need to me, there's no way that I can meet it, right? So that's it. I hope you enjoyed. I'm sorry it's a little long, but references are going to be at the end, and thank you very much.